Morning, citizens. Who do we think our real enemies are? I mean, the mainstream would have us believe that Vladimir Putin is the biggest bogeyman. That's the one they want us to, line up against. Um, and maybe he is. Maybe he is. Um, he's certainly an autocrat. You don't get to be the top of a country like that without being ruthless. Um, but it's also very convenient, isn't it? An external enemy. It's the oldest trick in the book, really. Um, and his, his activities of late and the war in Ukraine give the perfect excuse to the mainstream to demonize him. He's the new he's the new Hitler, obviously. Um, I mean, as far as foreign leaders go, as much as they are enemies. Um, I don't think he's nearly as dangerous as um, Xi Jinping. Um, but that's assuming that foreign leaders are our biggest enemies, and of course, I don't think they are. But many of you don't think that either. I'm still puzzled as to why the Americans, in particular, have decided, or at least let, let's make a distinction here. The American administration have decided to pick a fight with Putin, um, which has just driven him into the arms of China. So now America has two massive foes to deal with at the same time. Um, so this is puzzling in a conventional sense, in a conventional geopolitical sense. But foreign leaders are not our biggest enemy, um, even if they ever were. And so many things have happened to make me even question whether the biggest bogeymen of history have actually been our real enemies. Yeah. But most of us, of course, realise now that our biggest enemies are at home. They're our own governments, and they are the people behind our own governments, and they are the massive financial interests, seen and unseen, behind the scenes, who are directing government. People like BlackRock and Vanguard, and on a sort of a lesser but nevertheless still very dangerous entities like Serco in this country, who are profiting from the, uh, the mass immigration and the wholesale replacement of the indigenous population, and they're profiting from it. You know, um, as if most of the people working for Serco won't be replace themselves in the end. So there's people like that. You know, there's uh, Rishi Sunak, and Keir Starmer, Sadiq Khan, Defeffel Johnson, David Cameron, the entirety of the Labour Party, and almost all of the Conservative Party, um, all of the institutions, all of the people pushing all this diversity and inclusion narrative, and all the coercion and the bullying that comes with that. So these are people that we've and institutions we've come to realise that are determinedly not on our side, and in fact are almost the definition of enemies of us ordinary, normal, working taxpayers. But there are others. There are others who are, in their way, even more dangerous. And there's plenty of them. But the one that really struck me recently was the American comedian Louis C.K. Now, I don't know a great deal about him, only that he's a very successful comedian, and he had a fall from grace some years ago um, because of his depraved sexual habits. Um, and it sounds as if he was, you know, it sounds as if he was rightly um, called out for that behaviour in much the same way, or as someone like Bill Cosby, although it's not as serious as what Bill Cosby seems to have done. Although it is pretty serious, that kind of vile, disgusting behaviour, and I'm sure you can look it up to find out what the details of it are. But um, he was doing an interview with he was being interviewed on the Joe Rogan show, and I didn't see the whole thing because I'm not that interested in him. Um, I haven't seen much of his work, so I don't think that he's the funniest person necessarily, but maybe it's because I haven't seen enough of his work. But it was obvious that Rogan had some respect for him, because Rogan's a comedian as well, and there's probably a camaraderie between comedians. Um, but he was saying really quite the most treacherous things, and doing his best to make it sound reasonable. Um, from the clips that I've seen, Rogan didn't call him out on it, but he was basically saying that he believes that the borders should be kept open because Americans have had it too good for too long, and that it shouldn't be so good in America, and that America should have to. I mean, it's funny the banal way he presented it, considering how inventive um, comedians often are in the way that they say things. Even if you don't agree with them on certain things, they can still be quite entertaining, and the point of a comedian is it makes you look at things in a different way. Um, some years ago, I was played a clip of Jim Jeffries um, having it go at Americans and the Second Amendment, and this is before I changed my mind on guns completely. Um, but it was quite funny, you know. He was funny, and he made the the whole notion of um, having the right to bear arms sound ridiculous. So he was doing what a comedian does: look at things from a different way and and make it sound funny. And of course, if you are a comedian and a political activist, which he seems to be, you make the other side seem ridiculous. And like I say, it was funny. It was funny. Um, but Louis C.K. wasn't funny at all. And he was talking about, well, not specifically, but by implication, he was suggesting that Americans just have to accept their country being made worse because, in some perverse way, it's good for Americans. He was saying that America having it so easy for so long is not good for Americans. Now, Americans have had it easy for a long time, which is the nature of being part of a superpower, is that the superpower uses its power to make things better for its population. Now, the American superpower has used its position and its military and economic might to disadvantage other countries at the expense, um, advantage its own population at the expense of others. Now that's just what superpowers do, and I mean that's what the British Empire did when Britain was on top. But even at the height of the British Empire, being a working class person in 1890 wouldn't have been a bowl of cherries, that's for sure. Um, and Americans, as I understand it, just like the rest of people in the so-called rich Western democracies, are also having a hard time now, comparatively. I mean, Americans are having a hard time comparatively, but it's not hard times like they're having Chad. But I just thought that was the weirdest thing to say, because basically what he was saying was that the border must be left open so that Americans' lives become worse. And of course, he makes these pronouncements from the position of somebody that I presume is a multimillionaire, and doesn't have to compete with on the lower rungs of the socio-economic scale with people who've just turned up out of nowhere and are willing to work for fuck all. And his logic was so um, base, crude. It wasn't clever, it wasn't intelligent, and it wasn't funny, um, which is kind of what you'd expect from a comedian. Um, And the thing about that is that it's not only an insult to ordinary Americans who are just trying to make a living, and just through no fault of their own were born in a superpower, and are fortunate to have born in being born in a superpower. Um, and he was saying that their lives had to be made worse so that people who have no loyalty to America and have done nothing to build America can just come to America and take what Americans have. Now, I know that America being a ruthless superpower, like all superpowers, has used its position to enrich America at the expense of ordinary people in other countries. That's just what happens. Sure, that's what happens. But there are worse superpowers than America. We'll find that. When China's in charge, we'll really find that. But like I say, it wasn't just an insult to ordinary Americans who are just trying to make a living and raise families and just be normal, decent people. It's also an insult to everybody, past generations of Americans who've made America what it is today. 150 years ago, the pioneers were opening up the West, and you had solitary men with a horse and a map and a gun going out and opening up the country and building it, having with just those things, and all that effort, which of course wasn't at all guaranteed, and very often resulted in failure and death, the stuff that we don't necessarily hear about, because in that American tradition we celebrate the winners. But that all now counts for nothing, and that people from all around the world who haven't made their countries better, and maybe it's not their fault, but they haven't done, have just been encouraged to, well, you don't have to make your own country better. Just go to America or Britain or Western Europe or Australia. And you don't have to make anything. Just go there and everything will be better. And you'll be fed and clothed and housed over and above the native population. And you'll be told that it's the right thing to do because Americans are so evil. And it's America's fault that your country's so shit. So these are the people we have many enemies, but people like that are the biggest enemy. As far as I can, as far as I can say, I can tell, America doesn't have any bigger enemies than people like Louis C.K. And what's so surprising is an astonishing lack of gratitude from people like that. I mean, Louis C.K. wouldn't be successful if he hadn't grown up in the American society that nurtured him. Sure, he's a great comedian, so I'm told, um, and he's in that respect, he's done it himself, and it's not a quick glance at his Wikipedia page doesn't suggest that he's sort of inherited any particular privilege. Um, so he presumably has, got there supposedly by his own efforts, but nobody ever gets anywhere completely by their own efforts. If America wasn't America, if America was, I don't know, Brunei or Paraguay, he might never have become successful. You know, he became successful because he was giving something to America, and America appreciated it, and he was enriched by that society. And all of the people that have made him a multimillionaire are now being told that they've had it too good. He's not he's by no means the only one. The credentialed uh, middle class who've all got their useless non-jobs that they get paid a huge amount for. Diversity and inclusion officers, um, over people who do real productive things in the society. We know that you know, celebrities are as shallow as they come. There are exceptions, but most of them are. Well, what should we say? Most of them are overprivileged. They have privilege. And Louis C.K. was using his privilege to tell everybody else they're not allowed to have any privilege. You know, they're not even allowed to have the privilege of being Americans, even though there's generations upon generations upon generations of people who built America. Of course, his supporters will just say, "Oh, it's just compassion. It's just compassion for all the what should we call them, the huddled masses, as we would have called them in an earlier time, um, and wishing that other people, non-Americans, can have their day in the sun, can have their piece of the pie." But who was it who built America? It was modern Americans. From the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts to just ordinary people. The man with a horse, a map, and a gun. Just ordinary people. All of those people made America what it is, and in past times, Americans were rightly proud of what they'd achieved. You know, of course there are casualties. Of course uh, of course there are historical injustices. There were people living there before European Americans got there. There were people there, and it's terrible what happened to them, to the Native Americans. But such is history. And of course, these people of this ilk are not just multimillionaire comedians. These people are your neighbours, as I said before. These are people who you chat with about the weather, and you think that they're normal, and they're not. They're not normal. They're treacherous vipers, and they live amongst us, and they always have, and we've never really noticed it, although many of us have sort of suspected and wondered where their loyalties lie. And these are the people that hold open the gates for the barbarians. You this is what happens. Come on, you look. My cat digging her claws into me. Right, lie down. And we suffer particularly badly from the sort of self-hating Brit. And I had no idea that Americans had an equally big problem. George Orwell talked about these people even during the Second World War. The people who got a kick out of Britain being humiliated. As he said, they didn't actually want Germany or Japan to win the war, but they got a real kick out of um, British humiliations, like at Singapore. And that was during the Second World War. That was before victory was even assured. I mean, this spectre that we may face um, with our soon-to-be Labour government and talking about a blasphemy law, which they will call um, and a law to combat Islamophobia. Um, if you look at the all-party parliamentary group definition um, on Islamophobia, which is what they want to be adopted, and was and due to the Labour Party's reliance on the Muslim vote, um, is one of the things in it is that they are suggesting that, I don't know the wording, but that it's unfair for Muslims um, to be subject to any kind of loyalty test in the way that other members of the public are not. And you can understand that in a sense that in a sense it is unfair that some people might be subjected to some sort of loyalty test and others aren't. But that isn't a test in law at all. But it is sort of it is what many people are thinking. And considering that because of all the terror attacks and the mass rapes and the constant demonisation of anything British and um, deciding with um, Gaza over their own constituents, um, is a loyalty test is appropriate. If somebody says, death to Britain and death to the West, and there's going to be Islamic Caliphate and Sharia law, um, and make their hatred and contempt for the country they live in plain and obvious and vocal, then you'd have to be an idiot not to conclude from that these people are not loyal. So they can say the most disloyal things imaginable, and you're not allowed to question their loyalty. What next? It's almost as bad as questioning whether a man in a dress is actually a man or a woman. But our society would never be as stupid as that, would it? I saw a video the other day of some guy. He was filming a bloke putting up a ULEZ camera, or maybe he was putting up another one that had just been cut down. And he was on side. He was against the guy doing the video was trying to shame these blokes for putting this ULEZ camera up, and in my opinion, he should shame them, because these are the people who will just follow orders. Oh, I've got a mortgage to pay. I've got a mortgage to pay, so I'm going to make sure that other people who've got mortgages to pay can't pay their mortgage, so that I can pay my mortgage. And they just say, oh well, um, I'm just doing my job, mate. And of course, this is interesting because with the two blokes putting the camera up were two fucking goons, real proper goons, thugs. Um, look like proper tough blokes. I mean, they look like they've been to the gym a lot. You know, I mean, the guy running, guy filming it, asking this bloke whether he's got some carpets under his arms, and they were there to protect the blokes ruining everybody else's freedom. And I think these people should be shamed. But it's interesting that Transport for London and Sadiq Khan is prepared not only to pay people to put those cameras up, but is also presumably prepared to pay for the goons to protect the blokes putting the cameras up. The fact that these blokes are being um, are being intimidated by ordinary members of the public is a good thing. Intimidation sounds like a horrible thing, doesn't it? But some people fucking deserve it. Some people deserve to be intimidated. You know, and the defence is always the same. Oh, it's unacceptable to intimidate people than just doing their job. It's unacceptable to intimidate people who are putting up the walls of your prison. So that's unacceptable, is it? And we really have to get away from this idea that just because something's passed in law that we have to that we have a moral duty to abide by it. My lawyer friend once, it was, you know, we were talking about something or other, um, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something that um, it was an intellectual discussion rather than a real thing. But it was, um, I think it was just something like, would you ever rob a bank if you thought you'd get away with it? And he said no, and I said why? And he said for every reason, you know. And I thought, well, okay, that's. I kind of knew where he was coming from, you know. Um, and but where he was coming from was from an earlier age when the law was something to be respected, um, when institutions were to be respected, and that the rule of law was something that kept us from, anarchic savagery. You know. But the law doesn't do that any longer. The law just attacks people who complain about anarchic savagery. You know, I mean, this ridiculous thing they've got in California where you can steal $900 worth of stuff and there is no legal comeback on you whatsoever. I mean, if that's not a society destroying plan, I don't know what is. And we're getting that in this country as well. People think that it's just okay just to take stuff. And what happens when people just take stuff? Just go into a shop and take stuff, you don't pay for it. I mean, and then tell their mates, so you just go in there and take stuff, and they'll do nothing. So 10 blokes go in there, and then 50 blokes go in there, and in a few days the shelves are empty, and the shop hasn't got any money for all that lost stock. So what do? Do they restock the shop so it can happen again next week? No, they shut the shop and fire everybody, and they don't open the shop in that area, and they move out, and then you've got an empty shop, and then you haven't got any. That's where people used to buy stuff, and now they can't do that. Now I don't know who these people are who are doing that. Um, I mean, it's tempting to think. I'm, I'm sure this probably is the case. It's tempting to think that these are people who have not been acclimatized to living in a country that supposedly lives by the rule of law. And who are these people? They're people who come from somewhere else, and they might even come from somewhere else there aren't any shops, and they can, the way they get stuff is to take stuff. And we often talk about a high trust society and low trust society, and all the lefties, you know, just piss all over the idea of a high trust society. But I remember years ago talking when I was working in Nigeria, talking to a bloke about. I just mentioned that they put um, milk bottles outside people's houses, put milk outside the house, and he was just astonished that the milk didn't get stolen. And it's not because he was a bad person; it's just because he didn't live in a high trust society. You know, in a low trust society, you just take stuff. And there's no way that a society can survive without that level of society, without that level of trust. I mean, British society, as American and other Western societies, they live on trust. I mean, this trust is getting eroded all the time, all the time. And, particularly with surveillance and biometrics and all that sort of stuff. Um, but there's no way that 130,000 police officers in the UK can cope with a society where people just go into shops and just take stuff. There just aren't enough of them. And this is part of, the degradation of society in a general and a philosophical way. Change society from a high trust society to a low trust society. And one of the ways you do that is, one of the insidious ways you do that is, you don't take anybody's word for anything. You know, your word is no longer your bond. The handshake doesn't mean anything. It has to be backed up. I mean, this has sort of been happening for a long time. It's like, maybe that the handshake wasn't enough, so you had a signature. But even the signature was on top of somebody's word. It was to say, well, I agreed to this, and there's my signature. So, but that's just considered, utterly quaint now. I mean, I'm getting I'm trying to get a mortgage, and and I've had to go through a lot of my finances and stuff, and something's flagged up on the credit report or something, and so I've looked at my credit report, and it's not too drastic, it's all right, but something flagged up on it, and so the guy who's arranging the mortgage says we've got to go and do the whole um, account thing, and there's this company called Check My File, yeah, and when I first, because you can look at the file, and you don't, there's a few invasive questions, you can look at it, um, but if you have to download it, you have to go through the whole panoply of stuff, and it's just fucking so invasive, and you have to take a photograph of yourself and then say, oh yeah, the biometrics are okay now. Fucking biometrics. Just trying to get a fucking mortgage. Trying to get a mortgage, and I'm having to abandon all my most deeply held principles just for that. You know, my most deeply held principles about invasiveness and surveillance they're just fucking steamrolled. No, we need your biometrics. But what about my word? What about my signature? What about my promise? I'm going to pay this. You know. No, well, that's no good. That's not good enough now. We need fucking biometrics. And why do they need biometrics? Because they don't fucking trust me. And they don't trust me because we now live in a society where nobody fucking trusts anybody. And it's become normalized. This is just a normal way of things now. You know, it's not done with a promise and a handshake and a nod of the head. You know, fraud has always been a problem. There are always people who take the piss. There's always people who game the system. Um, but that was just leakage. That was leakage of a free society. That when you have a free society, you have to accept that there's criminality and there are people who game the system and take the piss. You have to accept that. And this is what we used to accept. And because it was a high trust society, that stuff was minimal. Society could roll on and was prosperous enough to take that in its stride, to take that on the chin, and you know that is now no longer the case. And Is it no longer the case because British people have become so much less trustworthy? I don't think that's the case. You know, I don't think that's changed. I think what's changed is that we now have millions of people in this country who come from somewhere else where they don't have high trust societies. You know, if you don't live in a high trust society, why would you operate in a high trust ethos? Why would you? You wouldn't. You take what you can get. I mean, this is so depressing because there was nothing fundamentally wrong with Western societies. You know, sure, Western societies have used their military power and their wealth to enrich themselves further at the expense of other countries, but yeah, this is just the way things are. You know, I mean, countries have challenged the the established powers, and some of them have been beaten, and some of them haven't. In the 150 years ago, the 120, 130 years ago, Germany challenged British supremacy. And there was a big old war, and they did challenge it, and then there was and then they lost, and then they challenged it again, and then they lost, and they challenged it again, and up until recently, Germany has been, up until the last 10 years or so, um, Germany has been ahead. These things do change over time. Um, China's played the long game, you know, um, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with our societies, and they've just been deliberately destroyed. Deliberately destroyed by, dark forces behind the scenes. Um, but they also, and just as harmfully, being destroyed by people in plain sight. People like Louis C.K., the multi-millionaire Louis C.K., telling ordinary working Americans that they've got it too good. I mean, fuck, what? I mean, what a wanker. I mean, how dare he say things like that? How fucking dare he say things like that? He's become successful. He's hit a rich seam, but what does he do really? He tells jokes. He's not digging out house foundations. In the rain and the cold. Hacking away at frozen ground. He's not a single mother working 2 or 3 jobs. Working at a factory and then a supermarket checkout. How fucking dare he say this to people? He hit a rich scene. People liked what he did, and he became richly rewarded for it. But I mean, does he really deserve his millions? Yeah, he makes people laugh. Yeah, sure, that's a good thing to do. But his worth isn't so much that you know it's not 1,000 or 10,000 times more valuable than someone who's digging the foundations of your house that you're going to live in. I mean, I don't want to get, I don't know, I don't want to get um, what would you say? People become successful and they deserve their success. Largely, but one of the sort of faults of the capitalist system is um, that you get to a point of success where success just builds on itself and it requires no further input from you. This is why working lives, doing working everyday jobs and working in society when you've got massive inflation and the cost of living and all the rest of it is that's why it's so difficult to get out of that. That people have, live on a subsistence level for a long time, and if they're lucky, they can claw their way out of it. But somebody like Louis C.K., just he becomes a comedian. He's very good at it. He's appreciated, and then all of a sudden he's got 100 opportunities. He's got 100 opportunities. So instead of being down the local bar, you know, doing a 3 minute stand up to 100 people, suddenly it's you know 1,000 people, and then it's 10,000, and then it's 100,000, and then there's millions all over the television and the internet. I mean, he probably hasn't got any funnier. But I'm not suggesting that people who become successful don't deserve what they have. Um, Although I kind of am suggesting that, but there's nothing you can do about that once you become successful and you get to a stage where, unless you're a complete idiot, success just breeds success, and that's just one of the unfairnesses of capitalism, and it's not perfect, but it's certainly better than trying to bring in a sort of leveling communism that brings America down to third world income levels, just so that some bloke who's just arrived from the Central African Republic can have as much as someone who's been working their whole lives in America and paying into the system. I mean, the other thing he was saying is that Americans having it so good, which they have in past times and not so much now probably, he was making this sort of really crash, which he probably thought was quite a clever point. This crass idea that if you get everything really easy, it's not actually good for you. Well, sure, that's probably true, um, and he's just talking about ordinary Americans here that they've had it too good and they need to be brought down a peg or two, and you know if you could make that argument that, and there is an argument that diversity brings a sort of resilience and strength that affluence doesn't. Yeah, sure, that isn't good for you. When things are too easy, you become fat and lazy. That's certainly the case. But he's not suggesting in the same breath, which he should be, is that having failed to build something and make your own country better, you just decide to go to a rich country and take what they have. I mean, is that good for somebody psychologically? You know, Rather than build something, you just take what somebody else has got. Is that good for you? It's just this double standard you get in everything. It's just double standard you get in everything. It's like, you know, racism's everywhere, but racism against white people just doesn't exist. You know, even though it obviously does exist, and it exists right up to the very highest levels. And this sort of anti-white racism is part of destroying Western countries. And this double standard extends to, if Americans have it too easy, they get fat and useless, and they don't deserve it. And but third world immigrants who failed to do anything in their own countries come to America and take everything that Americans have. Take all the welfare, take all the, the housing. Somehow that's psychologically okay for them. What's good for the goose is not good for the gander, apparently. But we're moving into some interesting times, which is probably the best way I can put it. Um, we're told that a completely unwanted Labour government are now going to have the biggest um, majority in history. And, Keir Starmer's just walking around on eggshells, saying nothing for fear of saying the wrong thing, because all he has to do is just not say the wrong thing and he'll be in number 10. And the Conservatives have managed to destroy themselves. Completely unforced errors. And it does make you wonder whether that was the plan all along. Rishi Sunak was installed to destroy the Conservatives, to let Labour in so they can destroy the country. But we see the game. We see what they're up to. And this is the same sort of thing, isn't it? Is that when London stank of shit so badly that they couldn't sit in the Houses of Parliament, then they did something about it. But they didn't do anything about it until then. And as we keep saying, it's got to get worse before it gets better. And I'm afraid that is what seems to be what's going to happen. Doesn't mean it won't be interesting though. And at least the sun is shining, although there's a bit of chemtrail activity out there, I think, but we'll see. It's due to cloud over in an hour or so. So I was glad I came out here again. But we mustn't be downhearted about this. We must be angry, but not downhearted. We can be both. And things appear to be changing in Europe, which is interesting. It sounds like Britain's the outlier is going the wrong way, but there'll be a corrective. But anyway, everybody try and enjoy the weather while it lasts, and most of all, we have to stay free. See ya.